What if I told you, there were times in history so dark, so cruel, that living just one day in them could break even the strongest person alive today? Moments where death wasn't a possibility, it was the only constant. Where the air smelled of rotting flesh, hope was a distant memory, and survival was a matter of luck, not strength. We often think we've got it rough. Long workdays, bills, heartbreak, the stress of modern life. But compared to what humanity has endured before us, we live in a golden age. There were centuries where entire cities vanished without a trace, where children starved in the arms of their helpless parents, and where even the mightiest empires fell to disease, war, or sheer madness. And this wasn't fiction. This was real. These were actual points in time when being born was a death sentence, when the world felt like it had turned against its own people. Today, we're taking a look at 7 of the absolute worst times to be alive in human history. And trust me, each one is more insane than the last. And number 3? That one might just haunt your dreams. Welcome to Brothers Explore, where the past isn't dead. It's waiting. 1. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351. Let's start with one of the deadliest pandemics the world has ever seen. The Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept across Europe, Asia, and North Africa like a storm from hell, killing an estimated 200 million people. That's nearly half of Europe's population, gone in just a few short years. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, royal or peasant, once the sickness reached your town, the clock was ticking. It began with a fever, chills, and vomiting. Then came the black boils, oozing, painful, and bursting with pus. And then, silence. People died within days. Entire families were wiped out before anyone could even bury the bodies. In fact, so many were dying so fast, that bodies were stacked like firewood in the streets. Some cities dug mass graves the size of football fields. Doctors wore creepy bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, not because it helped, but because they believed bad smells caused the disease. And nobody knew what was really happening. The worst part? The plague didn't just kill people. It shattered economies, collapsed societies, and left survivors convinced the end of the world had truly arrived. This wasn't a disease. It was a horror story, written in blood. Why it was awful. The horror of the Black Death wasn't just in how fast it killed, it was in how little anyone understood it. One day, your town was bustling. A few days later, it was silent. Streets were littered with rotting bodies, homes abandoned, livestock wandering through empty alleys. There were no answers, only fear, superstition, and death. Medicine was useless. Science didn't exist the way we know it today. Priests offered prayers, doctors applied leeches, and people burned incense in the streets hoping to purify the air. Nothing worked. Some villages lost 90% of their population. Imagine that, walking through your neighborhood and realizing 9 out of 10 people you knew were dead. Families were torn apart. Entire communities vanished. In some towns, there weren't enough living left to bury the dead. The world felt cursed. Imagine watching your entire village disappear in less than a week. Your family, your friends, gone. No medicine, no cure, just whispers of sin, punishment, and God's fury. To them, this wasn't a disease, it was Judgment Day. 2. The year 536 AD, the worst year in human history. If you think your worst year was bad, wait until you hear about 536 AD, a year so catastrophic, scientists and historians alike call it the worst year to be alive in all of recorded history. It began without warning. A strange, gray fog slowly blanketed parts of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The sky dimmed. The sun still rose, but it no longer shone. For the next 18 months, the world was trapped under a ghostly twilight. Days felt like dusk. Even at high noon, the sun looked like a dull ember behind smoke. No one knew why it was happening. And worse, no one could stop what came next. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Crops withered in the fields. Famine swept across continents. Snow fell in China during summer. In Ireland, ancient records speak of years when bread simply didn't exist. Empires began to fall apart. Trade routes collapsed. Starvation spread. War followed. And to the people who lived through it, it felt like divine punishment, or the end of the world. Modern scientists believe the cause was a colossal volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, that blasted ash so high into the atmosphere, it blocked sunlight worldwide. It triggered a chain reaction of global cooling, crop failure, and human misery that lasted for years. This wasn't just a bad year. It was the world pressing pause, and daring humanity to survive. Global impact expanded. What followed the disappearance of the sun wasn't just strange, it was catastrophic. With sunlight blocked for over a year, global temperatures plummeted. Crops failed on a massive scale. Fields that once fed kingdoms became barren wastelands. In Europe and Asia, livestock died from starvation, and people began turning on one another just to survive. Famine spread like wildfire. In Ireland, historical records speak of a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In China, people reported snow falling in midsummer, and widespread droughts that sparked rebellion and collapse. Entire economies crashed. Trade routes withered. Empires, already fragile, began to fall apart, not from war, but from hunger and cold. There are even reports of people resorting to cannibalism in isolated villages. The very structure of civilization cracked under the pressure of nature's wrath. And the worst part? This darkness, this choking veil over the earth, wasn't fully understood for over 1,000 years. The sun didn't just disappear, the world changed. It was like someone pulled the plug on earth. Light vanished. Warmth died. And humanity was left to face a global reset. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a real-life apocalypse, and it lasted for years. 3. The Mongol Invasions, 1206 to 1368. Coming in at number 3, one of the bloodiest rampages the world has ever seen. In the early 1200s, a warlord rose from the harsh steppes of Mongolia, a man who would change history through fire, steel, and sheer terror. Genghis Khan. His name still echoes like thunder across time. What began as tribal warfare quickly turned into an unstoppable storm. Genghis Khan and his successors carved their empire across Asia and into Europe, building the largest land empire in human history. But this wasn't just about conquest. It was annihilation. Entire cities were wiped off the map. If a town resisted, it was destroyed, men slaughtered, women taken, children sometimes buried alive. By the time the dust settled, the Mongol invasions were responsible for the deaths of an estimated 40 to 60 million people. That's more than the entire population of some continents at the time. They killed so many people, some scientists believe it actually cooled the planet, with farmland abandoned and forests regrowing, drawing carbon from the air. The Mongol invasions weren't just brutal, they were beyond anything the world had ever seen. Entire cities were wiped off the map, erased as if they'd never existed. Streets ran red with blood as rivers carried the lifeblood of countless victims far from battlefields. But the Mongols didn't stop at sheer violence. They mastered terror as a weapon. When a city refused to surrender, the Mongols unleashed one of the most terrifying tactics in history: biological warfare. They would catapult the rotting corpses of plague victims, or those dead from disease, over city walls, turning fear into a weaponized plague. The infected bodies spread sickness among defenders, weakening resistance and spreading death from within before a single sword was drawn. This ruthless use of disease, combined with overwhelming brutality, shattered defenses, and broke the will of entire populations. The Mongols became not just conquerors, but harbingers of nightmare, where the ground was soaked with blood and the air thick with fear. For many, the arrival of the Mongol horde meant more than war, it meant inevitable, inescapable destruction. This wasn't war. It was a moving apocalypse. Imagine hearing that an army was coming, not to conquer, but to erase everything you know. No negotiations. No survivors. Just fire, death, and silence. For over a century, the world lived in fear of hooves pounding in the distance. 4. World War I trenches, 1914 to 1918. Imagine living in a never-ending nightmare, mud up to your knees, constant shellfire shaking the ground beneath you, and the smell of death everywhere. During World War I, millions of soldiers were trapped in trenches, long, narrow ditches carved into the earth that stretched for miles across battlefields in Europe. These trenches weren't just homes, they were prisons. For months on end, men lived in freezing cold winters and boiling hot summers, surrounded by filth, mud, and swarms of disease-carrying rats the size of cats. These rats fed on the dead, and on the living. Food was scarce, clean water almost non-existent. Soldiers suffered from trench foot, a painful condition caused by constant wetness that could lead to gangrene and amputation. The constant fear of sudden death from artillery shells or sniper bullets was unbearable. And then there was the psychological horror. Shell shock, the mental trauma from relentless bombardment and witnessing the horrors of war. Thousands died in these trenches, not always from battle wounds but from disease, starvation, and despair. To them, every day was a fight to simply stay alive. Hell on earth. Living in the trenches during World War I was nothing short of hell on earth. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if it would be your last, surrounded by mud, blood, and the deafening roar of artillery shells exploding all around you. The ground constantly shook as barrages rained down, tearing the earth apart and raining shrapnel on anything that moved. But the horror didn't stop with the guns. Poisonous clouds of chemical gas drifted into the trenches, choking soldiers, burning their lungs and eyes, turning the battlefield into a deadly trap where you couldn't see the enemy, but death was closing in from every direction. The cold was merciless. Winter froze fingers and toes until frostbite forced soldiers to have parts of their bodies amputated just to survive. Rain turned the trenches into cesspools of mud and human waste. Men lived and died knee-deep in filth. And the mind suffered too. Endless shelling shattered nerves, giving rise to what was then called shell shock, a terrifying psychological trauma that left soldiers shaking, unable to sleep or speak, haunted by the horrors they'd seen. In these trenches, it wasn't just the enemy that threatened your life, it was the earth itself, the sky, the water, and the mind. You didn't just face death once, you died a little bit every single day. Every cold morning waking up covered in mud and blood, every night spent shivering as shells exploded nearby. The rats gnawed at your fingers, the stench of death filled the air, and hope slowly slipped away with each passing hour. In those trenches, survival wasn't a victory, it was a brutal, endless punishment. You were trapped in a living nightmare where the enemy wasn't always visible, but death was always certain. 5. The Great Chinese Famine, 1959 to 1961. Imagine a country of over 600 million people suddenly gripped by a catastrophe so severe, it left millions starving in silence. Between 1959 and 1961, China experienced one of the deadliest famines in human history, a disaster fueled not by natural disaster alone, but by catastrophic government policies under Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward. In a desperate push to modernize agriculture and industry, farms were collectivized and traditional farming practices were discarded overnight. Crops were requisitioned by the state, leaving little food for the farmers themselves. Meanwhile, inflated reports of production success masked the truth, fields were failing, and food was running out fast. Millions of families faced unimaginable hunger. People scavenged for anything edible, tree bark, grass, even boiling leaves and roots. In the most desperate cases, families turned on each other in acts of survival. Estimates suggest between 15 and 45 million people died, more than the casualties of many major wars combined. For those who lived through it, the Great Chinese Famine was a nightmare of silent suffering, where hope was rationed as tightly as the food. Dark reality. The Great Chinese Famine wasn't just about empty stomachs, it was a nightmare that tore communities apart and plunged millions into unimaginable despair. As food vanished, entire villages faced starvation. People were pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. There are chilling reports of cannibalism, desperate acts born from sheer survival instinct, where families faced the unthinkable to stay alive. The government, meanwhile, refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. Officials covered up the truth, reporting inflated crop yields and hiding the real death toll. Any attempts to speak out were silenced. Information was tightly controlled, and relief efforts were slow, leaving millions to suffer in silence. This was a time when hope was scarce, trust was shattered, and every day was a battle against hunger, fear, and betrayal. The Great Chinese Famine wasn't just a tragedy, it was a horrifying chapter where human suffering was hidden in the shadows, buried beneath layers of lies and denial. This wasn't caused by bombs or storms. It wasn't a natural disaster striking from the outside. This was a famine created by human hands, by decisions made in cold, distant halls of power. Millions starved not because the land failed, but because policies failed. It was a slow-motion disaster, one no one could escape or stop. And the silence around it was as deadly as the hunger itself. Imagine living through a nightmare where the enemy isn't a foreign army or the weather, but your own government. That's the terrifying reality of the Great Chinese Famine. 6. The Atlantic Slave Trade Era, 16th to 19th century. One of the darkest chapters in human history unfolded over 3 centuries, when millions of men, women, and children were ripped from their homes in Africa and forced into unimaginable horrors. The Atlantic slave trade was a monstrous system of human trafficking on an industrial scale. Entire communities were raided, families torn apart, and innocent people chained like cargo in the holds of ships. The journey across the Atlantic was a nightmare beyond words. Packed into cramped, suffocating spaces below deck, slaves faced disease, starvation, and abuse. Many didn't survive the voyage, dying before ever seeing a new land. Those who did arrive faced a lifetime of brutal slavery, treated as property, stripped of identity, and forced into backbreaking labor under merciless conditions. This trade wasn't just about economics, it was about dehumanization on a scale that scars the world to this day. The consequences echo through generations, shaping societies and lives far beyond the shores of Africa. Conditions. The horrors of the Atlantic slave trade began the moment people were forced onto those ships. Cramped together like cattle in the dark, suffocating holds, slaves were packed so tightly there was barely room to breathe. Starvation gnawed at their bellies, and disease spread like wildfire through the filthy, airless quarters. Many were chained by their wrists and ankles, unable to move or even tend to their basic needs. Families were ripped apart, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives, never to see each other again. The cries of those trapped below deck were drowned out by the creaking of the ship and the relentless ocean waves. For weeks, sometimes months, these human beings endured unimaginable suffering on a voyage where survival was uncertain. Those who made it alive faced a life where freedom was a distant dream. Sold and bought like livestock, stripped of identity and humanity. Brothers explore twist. Imagine your entire life, your hopes, your dreams, your family, erased in an instant. Not because of anything you did, but simply because of who you were. A life reduced to a price tag, a number in a ledger. This was the brutal reality for millions whose stories too often remain silent in history's shadows. 7. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. In August 1945, the world witnessed a terrifying new level of destruction, a moment when human technology unleashed a force unlike anything before. The United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instantly wiping out tens of thousands of lives in a blinding flash of fire and fury. In Hiroshima alone, over 70,000 people died instantly, buildings vaporized, streets turned to rubble, and a mushroom cloud rose like a monstrous storm over the city. But the horror didn't end with the blast. Survivors faced searing burns, agonizing radiation sickness, and a slow, painful death that haunted them for years. Families were torn apart, and entire communities were shattered. The bomb changed warfare forever, introducing a weapon so devastating it threatened the very future of humanity. It forced the world to confront a terrifying question: how far are we willing to go to win? Aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 1945. The immediate devastation was unimaginable, but for those who survived the atomic blasts, the nightmare had only just begun. Thousands were left with horrific burns that refused to heal, their skin blistered and peeling from the intense heat. Many suffered agonizing radiation sickness, a slow and painful decline marked by nausea, hair loss, and relentless fatigue. But the physical scars were only part of the story. Survivors, known as hibakusha, faced deep social stigma and rejection. Many were shunned by their own communities, seen as contaminated or cursed, forced to live lives of isolation and fear. Cancer rates skyrocketed among survivors, and countless families were torn apart by illness and despair. Generations born long after the bombs were still affected by genetic damage passed down from those fateful days. The bomb's shadow stretched far beyond the explosion, a lasting wound on humanity's conscience and a haunting reminder of the terrible cost of unchecked power. In just 1 second, your city, your home, your entire world was reduced to a shadow, a ghostly imprint burned forever into the ground. The flash of light was blinding, the heat unimaginable. Life as you knew it vanished in an instant. This was not just destruction, it was a new kind of horror, a terrifying glimpse into what humanity had unleashed on itself. Throughout history, there have been countless dark moments that shook humanity to its core. The Spanish Inquisition, where fear and suspicion turned neighbors into enemies, and thousands suffered unimaginable torture under the guise of faith. The Holocaust, a brutal genocide that extinguished 6 million Jewish lives and millions more, leaving scars that the world still struggles to heal. And the Great Depression, when economies collapsed overnight, plunging millions into poverty, hunger, and despair. These moments, though not the focus today, remind us that history is filled with pain and struggle, that humanity's worst times come in many forms, shapes, and stories. Each one a chapter in the long, difficult saga of survival. History isn't always a tale of glory and triumph. Sometimes, it's a haunting story of suffering, fear, and survival against unimaginable odds. As we journey through these darkest chapters, it becomes clear just how fragile life really is, and how close humanity has come to the edge more times than we can count. Now, we want to hear from you. Which of these nightmare eras shook you to your core? Was it the relentless terror of the Mongol invasions? The endless misery in the World War I trenches? Or the unimaginable horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Drop your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the past and how it shapes our present. And if you want to keep exploring the shadows of history, the mysteries, and the stories that still haunt us today, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Because here at Brothers Explore, the past isn't just history, it's alive, it's real, and it's waiting to be uncovered. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the darkest stories often hold the brightest lessons.